welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival, Day 2. I hope that you all have been able to enjoy some of our great programming this weekend. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival. We have been so excited about the festival this year because even though we're online, we have been able to invite so many new and different people. And people are coming in from all over the world, including Jennifer, who is in Uzbekistan right now. And it's our biggest festival ever. We have more than 100 participants this year, and it's been really great. Just a couple things before we get started. We're using the webinar format. That means you'll see and hear the panelists, but you won't see yourself. You probably know that because we're all Zoom experts now, but I'm just mentioning it. Please use the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom screen to let us know where you're from, or if you want to talk about the festival. But if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A tab, which is also at the bottom of the screen. That helps keep the questions organized and we can see them clearly. Yesterday was Independent Bookstore Day, which you probably heard. We, of course, want to support our independent bookstore partners, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky Bookshop in Newburyport. I will put the links to those bookshops in the chat. So we encourage you to support them or your own local independent bookstore. Now I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers. Aimee Liu is the best-selling author of the novel Glorious Boy, as well as Flash House, Cloud Mountain, and Face. Her nonfiction includes Gaining, The Truth About Life After Eating Disorders, and Solitaire. Her books include a Literary Guild super release and have been translated into more than a dozen languages. Her short fiction has received special mention from the Pushcart Prize. Jennifer Steil is an award-winning author who lives in many countries. As we said, she's currently in Uzbekistan. Her newest novel, Exile Music, explores an overlooked slice of World War II history following Jewish musicians who fled to Vienna in 1939 to seek refuge in the Bolivian Andes. It received a starred book list review and was chosen by Good Morning America as one of the 25 novels you'll want to read this summer. Thank you both so much for being here. And with that, I'm going to leave it to you. Thank you so much.
I'll kick it off. Thank you so much, Leslie. And I want to, before we get started, I wanted to thank Jennifer Entwistle and the Newburyport Literature Festival for hosting us and this incredible event. And also a special shout out to the Plum Island Book Group, who introduced me to the festival and to Jennifer. And so that's why we are here today. And I hope some of you are in the audience. So this is really, really fun for me, particularly. And so we want to start by talking about the origins of these books. The title of our talk is The Allure of Untold Stories. And in both of our books, I've known Jennifer for a while, and we didn't coordinate these books, but as it turns out, we have just layer after layer after layer of kind of common ground. They're both World War II stories from far corners of the world. And so Jennifer's, woo, there we go. So the magic of Zoom, it's like, woo. Yeah. Anyhow, the picture, if it would come into focus here. I don't know what the deal is. There we sort of go. Anyhow, that's the Andes on her cover. And so this book, the biggest untold story in it is the exodus of Jews to Bolivia during World War II. So Jennifer, why don't you kick it off by telling us how you discovered this Bolivian history that nobody ever talks about?
I will. I'll be delighted to do that. But first, I just have to say that I love talking to you, Aimee. This is not the first time Aimee and I have talked about our books, and I never, ever get tired of hearing about Glorious Boy and the stories behind it. So you're in for a treat. And thank you also to the Newburyport festival and a literary festival, and I'm delighted to be here for the first time. So thank you for being here and supporting both of us and your local bookshops. So I have the extraordinary good fortune of switching countries every 4 years. I left the US in 2006, and I haven't lived in the US since then. And so I'm constantly tripping over untold stories in the various places I end up. So I was in Yemen for 4 years, and then we were in Bolivia for 4 years because my husband got a job in Bolivia as the European Union head of delegation there. So my whole family moved to La Paz, Bolivia in 2012. And I was working on a different book at the time. I was working on my previous book, The Ambassador's Wife, and I wasn't looking for a new story, but new stories have a way of finding you when you're trying to get something else done. Uh, so my husband came home from a meeting with the Austrian honorary consul, really animated, and said, "Did you know there were 20,000 Jewish refugees living in Bolivia before, during, and after World War II?" And I'd had no idea. I knew there were plenty of Jewish refugees who arrived elsewhere in South America, in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela. I'd heard a lot of those stories, but I hadn't heard anything about Bolivia in particular. And I began to imagine, how difficult it must have been for these refugees who had left behind everyone they loved and knew, their homes, their professions, their livelihoods, and ended up in the middle of the Andes. And La Paz was pretty much a big town at the time and is at 12,000 feet. So the altitude is quite serious. So adjusting to La Paz today can be difficult for the altitude alone. And I was just imagining what it must have been like for these refugees. And I started looking around to see what else had been written about this part of the diaspora, and could find very little other than Leo Spitzer's brilliant memoir, Hotel Bolivia, and a bunch of other memoirs that have been written largely for people's families so that their stories didn't get lost. But there certainly were no other novels in English. And it seemed really important to me that this story not be forgotten. So that's where it all began. That's where the wheels began churning for me. So, Aimee, to turn it back to you, can you talk about how you happened to stumble upon the untold story of what was going on in the Andaman Islands during World War II? This was a history I knew nothing about. Your book is the first I've read about the Andaman Islands. So.
Yeah. Well, I knew nothing about it. I happened to hear about the Andaman Islands way back in 1998, I think, from an anthropologist's wife, and they had just come back there, and it sounded like this incredible place, this archipelago off the coast of Thailand, Myanmar, actually, Burma, and it was primeval forest still in the 1990s, largely. And she told me about indigenous tribes that went back 60,000 years there. So I was fascinated by that. But I knew nothing about the World War II history until I finally got there in 2010. My husband and I went to the Andamans, and you're right. I had no idea of that World War II history, but the first thing you see when you come to Port Blair, the one major town in the Andamans, are the bunkers all along the beaches that the Japanese left behind, these blood red bunkers everywhere. And then I was fascinated by the colonial history. Layers and layers and layers of untold stories in the Andamans. I've got to tell you, it's hard to know where to begin. The British first came to the Andamans and settled Port Blair as a penal colony for the Indian freedom fighters. So they basically took all of the people who were rebelling against the British Raj and put them first, well, they used them as convicts to build up the town, and then they built a huge jail and put them in. So I knew a little about that history, and that was one of the things that intrigued me. But while we were there, we went out to this little island off the mainland of Port Blair, And that's where the British had their cantonment. That's where all the British lived before the war. And it's this incredible living museum where the ruins of the old settlement, the British settlement, are there, and these massive ficus trees are growing up through the ruins. And you get this incredible evocative sense of colonialism and all of that. And it just so happened that there's a little gift shop there. My guide got all of these books because I was really interested in writing about this place, but I didn't really know what I was writing yet.
Mhm.
And the books, I opened them up, and here was the history of the Japanese occupation. And that was really the first time I realized that the Andaman Islands, Port Blair itself, was the Western front of the Eastern War. And it was the furthest west that the Japanese got, and they arrived there in 1942, just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. And had America not gotten into the war at that point, the Japanese would have used that as a jumping off place to take over the entire subcontinent of India, and the war might have turned out very differently. But it was just such a fascinating piece of history that brought all of these other layers together, because the indigenous people played a really important part in the war effort there, which is part of my story. But I won't talk too much more about that. But
Can I just ask you, Amy,
sure.
as a follow-up, I wonder if this might be a good time to just briefly summarize, what your book is about for people who may
Sure.
not have read it yet, just to make sure people are grounded in kind of the basic outlines of our stories.
That's true. That's true. Somehow I didn't didn't get that.
That's fine. It just
Okay.
occurred to me.
Thank you. Thank you. So the basic plot of my book is that a young aspiring anthropologist, somewhat similar to your story, Jennifer, she marries a young British doctor, and they are posted to this very remote location, the Andaman Islands, and they're young and they're hopeful, and she wants to be an anthropologist in the model of Margaret Mead, and he wants to explore medicinal botany in this rainforest. So they have these kind of grand scientific plans. And then, of course, she becomes pregnant and has the problems of being a young mother in the middle of nowhere and having grand ambitions. And they try and work it out. She does do time with the tribes, and she develops this, and their son, their glorious boy, is a difficult child who has he doesn't speak, he's speech delayed, and it turns out eventually they realize that he has something called Einstein Syndrome, which is what Einstein actually had, where he was basically too interested in the world and physics to learn to talk on time. And he was very impatient with people who interrupted his concentration. And that made him a fascinating person, but a very difficult child to raise, especially in the 1930s when nobody knew anything about this. So that's the core of the story. And then the war happens. They get there in 1937, and they've got a few years of kind of working out their family drama, and then the war happens, and the Japanese are arriving, and they're torn apart on the eve of the evacuation. And Claire, my main character, ends up in Calcutta, and Shep and Tai are stuck back behind enemy lines, and that's the beginning of the book.
Don't give it
Leave
away.
there.
Don't give it away.
So
Um,
let's get back to your book, Jennifer, and talk about music. You've told me that the another big untold story is the history of the Vienna Philharmonic. So tell us about that and how you discovered that and how that got woven into your book.
Okay, sure. Um, as part of that, maybe I should summarize just briefly what the book's about as well, because that kind of ties right into it. Um, so what so once I heard about this population, very shortly thereafter, I met a man named John Galanter whose parents were from a small village in Poland, and their 2-year-old daughter and their parents and the entire Jewish population of their village were murdered by the Germans and the Ukrainians. And they fled to Bolivia, which is where John, my friend John, was born. So I met him right after hearing about this Jewish population in La Paz. And John told me his family story, and I started reporting it. And then I thought about, well, if I were to tell this story, um, who would my characters be? What would they be doing for a living? And John, my friend, is a musician. He's a violinist. He was the concert master of the Bolivian orchestra. He's always been involved with music, and so that was the first thing to come to my mind because I'd been speaking with him. Also, I have a habit of giving my characters jobs I wish I had so that I can vicariously live through them. I can't play an instrument. I wish I could. I wish I were a composer. That is a magical talent that I do not possess. And so I thought if I couldn't do it, then the very least I could do was write about it. And so my family, I started out with a family in Vienna, Austria. And I picked Vienna because the next survivor I interviewed after John was a man named Guillermo Wiener. He was originally Wilhelm Wiener. He was from Vienna. And when he was 8 years old, he and his family fled Austria and came to Bolivia, which by 1938 was only one of 3 countries in the world still granting visas to Jews fleeing Nazi occupied Europe. So his family came over then, and he told me his story. He's still alive. He's 88 years old. He's still in La Paz. And his story was remarkable. And actually, his story provided me with the opening line of my book as well. Um, but anyway, while I was thinking about, okay, who are these family? I thought, okay, well, the parents, if they're both musicians, I thought I always find it more interesting if both parents are working because that's makes the writing more interesting for me. And so the father, I thought, well, the Vienna Philharmonic, I'll have him be a viola player for the Vienna Philharmonic, and the mother's an opera singer. And then I began researching the Vienna Philharmonic, which is where your question comes in. And the more I learned about it, the more horrified I was by the entire history of this orchestra, which plays beautiful music, but is a really terrible track record in terms of human rights and, um, well, in terms of not sending people to their deaths. They sent all of their Jewish musicians either to their deaths or into exile. They continued to employ Nazis until 1967. They didn't employ a woman until very recently. I mean, they seem to think that if you're not white and male, you can't possibly play an instrument very well. So I got very interested in this, and so that's the father's job, and the mother's an opera singer. And Orly, of my main character, it starts out as a little girl, and we can get into why I tell the story in her voice later. But so she's around 10 when the book opens. As she grows up in this musical family and this musical life. So Exile music starts in Austria, but 2/3 of the book is set in Bolivia and deals with how they recreate their entire lives in a foreign land where they don't speak the language, where they don't understand the cultures, where they are completely adrift. And Orly's brother gets left behind in Europe. So anyway, so that's a little bit about the book and the music bit.
Yeah,
So
it's huge. It's so great.
Now, Aimee, you mentioned briefly that the indigenous tribes play a critical role in your story, and especially for Claire, who's drawn to the island in part to learn about them. Can you talk to me about how you discovered information about these tribes, how you went about researching them perhaps, and their role in the war?
Yeah. As I said, this chance meeting with an anthropologist's wife got me interested in this first because these tribes in these islands go back 60,000 years to the first migration out of Africa. And I had not realized that there are parts of those tribes sort of all over Asia. There's some in the Philippines, there's some in the uh, Thai, Malaysian peninsula. Um, and but the ones in the Andaman Islands, it's such a small area of land, and it's fascinating. Some of you may have heard about the Sentinelese islanders who were shooting at planes after 9/11, and there was a young missionary guy who got murdered by them a few years ago when he insisted on going. It's a protected area. Their island, which is a very small island that's part of the Andamans, was definitely, it's always been off limits. For one reason, it's basically uninhabitable by anybody but these people because it's infested with crocodiles, and it's almost entirely swamp. And they've just evolved to live there. So that's them. But there were hundreds of tribes until the British came, and they have now been decimated. And so part of learning about these tribes, especially the Great Andamanese, who were the largest tribe in the middle of the archipelago, um, is trying to honor them and to give them voice and to remind people that they existed. Today there may be a handful of survivors of that tribe. After the British came, mostly syphilis wiped out almost all the tribes who had any contact with the British and the Indian convicts and the other outsiders who came in. But there had been a handful of anthropologists who had come and worked, and more recently there have been a number of Indian anthropologists who have tried to reconstruct the language or save the language of the few existing tribes. There's one there that's still a tribe that's I mentioned and also plays a big role in my book, the Jarawa tribe. And they have, because they stayed away, they were very hostile to all of the invaders. They survived the longest, although they are also shrinking, and it's hard to avoid contacts now with the Indians, who are basically turning in the Andamans into an eco tourist destination. But I tried to use all of the history that I could find around that period, the 1930s and the 1940s, and almost all of the stories that are in the book involving the tribal people are based on true. They're based on these documents that I got about the war when I was in Port Blair. They're based on actual historical facts that I found in other places. But it's a fascinating world, and I think we owe a great deal to all of these tribes, and they're just being wiped out all over the world. So I mean, I've learned a lot about indigenous people in the Amazon area. Brazil is wiping them all out. I've followed an organization called Survival International, which is all about trying to protect these tribal people and their habitat. But I'm afraid it's really a losing battle in today's world. So part of my goal in writing this book was really to honor this whole history and all of these people who we've lost over the generations.
Colonialism has a lot to answer for.
It does.
Ruinous legacy they left. Well, all colonizing countries.
Yeah. And one of the things I realized, obviously we both brought our books out in the middle of the pandemic and the whole Black Lives Matter thing. And so I was thinking so much about the the role that colonialism played in racism and setting the table for slavery in this country. And it's an element of history. We sort of, our sense of that stops with slavery in America, but you really have to keep going back, because there were hundreds of years of colonialism that basically enslaved Black and brown people around the world before it even reached American shores. So one way or another, indirectly, I think that's part of what was driving me in this book, is to understand some of those layers and some of the interplay between the different races, at least in this small corner of the world. But let's switch gears now. One of the most fascinating things about your book, Jennifer, we both have kids. We both have, little small children in our stories. And the strange worlds of small children play a big role in both of our books. And actually, after your book came out, I learned a word, which is paracosm. And Orly, your primary character, has this imaginary world that she builds as a small child and then hangs on to and keeps sort of developing with her beloved childhood friend. And that plays a big role in your human story. And I wonder if you could tell us both how you learned about paracosms, and also what made you decide to weave that into your plot and your story.
Well, I owe this all to my daughter. I've stolen the best ideas for most of my books from my daughter, who's now 11 and is totally on to me, and is not going to allow this to happen if she's going to start charging me for copyright violation or something. But at the time when I was first thinking of this story and what voice to tell the story of this family in, I was thinking partly about Guillermo and the fact that he came when he was 8 years old, and coming that young allowed him the flexibility to really adapt to Bolivia in a way that has allowed him to feel that he is Bolivian. I mean, Guillermo is entirely Bolivian. He rejects Austria. Austria once invited him to come back. He weeps when he thinks about Austria, because he will never understand what the Austrians did to their Jewish population. So I wanted my main character to be someone who was young enough to be able to pick up Spanish really swiftly, to be able to serve as a guide for her parents, who will not pick up the language or the cultures as easily, who are not quite as outgoing as she is either. I've traveled around the world with a very small person who, had been on 14 international flights by the time she turned 1. So she's just grown up, being immersed in other languages. And I've watched her learn them with great envy. You plop a 3-year-old into a country and they're fluent in a matter of months. Whereas there I was slowly conjugating my verbs, But what happened is one morning we were in the kitchen while I was beginning to think about who I'd tell the story through. And she said to me, at that point, she couldn't remember where she lived before Bolivia. I think she was probably 3 or 4 when we had this conversation. And she said, "Where did we live before Bolivia?" And I said, "We lived in London." And she said, "Well, before London." And I said, "Jordan." And she said, "Well, before Jordan." And I said, "Yemen." And she said, "Well, before Yemen." And I said, "Well, before Yemen, you lived in my tummy." And she said, "Well, no, I mean, before I lived in your tummy." And I said, "Well, you didn't exist before you lived in my tummy." And she looked at me with this horrified expression and said, I existed. I existed in bunny belts, and it is a land that is populated by vegetarians and ruled by a hermaphrodite who equally represents the male and female aspects of people. She didn't use the word aspects, she was too young, but anyway, but she went on, and she spent the next 7 years developing this very complex paracosm, which incidentally is a word I first heard from my daughter. She was like, "By the way, I'm developing a paracosm with my friend Tilly." And I'm like, "What's a paracosm?" She's like, "You don't know what a paracosm is?" I love it when our children get really patronizing. And you call yourself a writer. Um, but so I thought, well, if I were a young girl growing up in Vienna at the time Orly was growing up in Vienna, and Hitler was growing ever closer. There was a sense of menace that increased every day. The grown-ups were talking about very scary things, and I didn't understand what was going on entirely. I would need an imaginary world. I would need somewhere to retreat to. And when I started thinking about a little girl inventing an imaginary world, I thought, well, it'd be much more interesting from a narrative point of view if she were doing this with someone. They could have a conversation about it. And that's how Annalisa was born, her closest friend, who she grows up with in Austria. So that's how that paracosm came into it. And Bunny Belts is, of course, woven. I mean, the book, she's 45 by the time the book ends, so it's not all told from the voice of the child as she's looking back. But yeah.
But it's so, it plays such an important part as a bond between these two girls that sort of transcends what's going on in the world and all of the things that tear them apart. This having this other world of, it's sort of another world of exile in a way. It's
Mm-hmm.
another place that they escape to. And it's
Yeah.
kind of a fascinating idea as a mirror of Bolivia in a way. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, where you choose to be exiled to versus where you can be exiled to,
Yeah,
or where
yeah.
you're forced to be exiled to. And yeah. But speaking of children, just to get back to Ty, the boy in your book, the one with the
Who also
Einstein.
has another world that he escapes to. Yeah, in a sense.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, and I know you've talked about reading a bit about that syndrome, and kind of what made you think that this would work narratively? Like, what made you first get the idea for a boy that doesn't speak, and kind of the frustrations that his mother would have with that, and how that plays a role in your greater narrative?
Yeah. Well, speaking of paracosm, I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but the kernel for the human story, the core story of my book came from a dream that I had way back in 2003. And in that dream, it was basically the wartime crisis evacuation scene that opens my book. So in the dream, there's a young native girl who became Nyla in my book, who's taking care of a little boy who's about 3 or 4, who doesn't speak. And the girl is hiding the little boy under their house because his parents are evacuating this island, and she knows they won't take her with them. And so she hides him for a long time, and then they come out, and when they come out into the road, at the end of the road, smoke is rising, the road is empty, everybody's gone, and she realizes, oh my God, what have I done? So that is really what started the story part of Glorious Boy. I had this dream, I had this situation, I had these characters. I didn't know where it took place. I didn't know what era it was. I didn't know why the island was being evacuated. And so, the research of this book was sort of figuring out, I had a sense, I'd heard of the Andamans, and I thought, I really want to set this book there. But then, so part of it was sort of searching for the context, which I found when I discovered the World War II history. The other part of it was trying to figure out why this child didn't speak. And he hadn't spoken in my dream. And that was sort of, for me, that was made it kind of like sacred territory. Like I couldn't mess around with the parameters of the dream. There was something in my subconscious that was saying, this is why I put this dream together this way, and it's your job to turn that into a novel. So it took me a couple of years, and there are there's one other piece to that speaking thing, which is a story my mother always told about somebody she knew had a little boy who didn't speak for years. And then at age 4, his first words to his family were, "Shut the goddamn door." And I always remember that story. And apparently it filtered into my subconscious as well. There was absolutely, so that told me there's nothing wrong with this child. This is not autism. This is not anything like that. This is, and then I heard I heard a woman on radio one time talking about how she hadn't spoken until she was 4 and she just wasn't going to do it. It was just, it was an act of will. And I thought, okay, this is really, so I started researching all of these different reasons why kids don't talk. And one of them is Einstein syndrome, which Einstein, as I said earlier, he just basically was, his brain was developing too quickly in the regions that had to do with art and music and physics and light and all of that. And speech came later, and his social abilities came later. And I thought, this is perfect. This is who this child is. And it gave me, I found a book called The Einstein Syndrome that basically just described my character and gave me all of these layers. Another untold story, you know, that I'd never heard about, and very few people have still to this day heard about it. But it was such a, and lots of brilliant physicists and composers. Schumann had Einstein syndrome. You know, all of the major physicists, a lot of conductors, and so that became a really important part and a fun part. And then while I was writing the book, I realized that one of my nieces has a little boy who, if you know, it's rarely diagnosed um, as Einstein syndrome, but he totally fits the profile. So then while I was writing the book, I was using him as my sort of prototype. And it was fun to watch him. He's an extraordinary child, and so, you know, it was like having Ty come to life. Um, and so that was really really fun. Um, and I know that in my book, we've talked about this a little bit between the two of us. Sometimes untold stories are untold for a reason. And in the case of the Japanese and the Andaman Islands, um, I only recently realized that a lot of the Japanese occupation stories, a lot of the Japanese atrocities during the war, and there were many of those atrocities in the Andaman Islands, a lot of them were covered up after the war because of the Cold War that followed right on World War II. And we were trying to, you know, develop friendship with Japan, and we were trying to develop Japan as an ally in the fight against communist China. And that's one of the reasons why we've never heard the stories of the Andaman Islands. And another reason is that it was the seat of the independence movement, and part of that reason for the Indian independence movement was sort of seated there because the Japanese lied and said, oh, you know, you have home rule and this is the jewel in the crown of, you know, Indian independence. And it was all a way that the Japanese were manipulating the Indian freedom fighters. And there's much more to that story, which I didn't go into in this book because I was already dealing with so many layers. I couldn't add another one, but it is one of the reasons why we've never heard about the Andamans or this particular history. And I wonder if there's something equivalent in the Bolivian story, and whether you've talked to other survivors and if they have mixed feelings about this story being told, or how does?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's different in that a lot of the people who came to La Paz had no intention of staying there if they could help it, because it was, again, it was a difficult place to live. It was a difficult place to make a living. And so a lot of the refugees they ended up moving either to the US or to Europe. And they thought of Bolivia as a place they stopped along the way, but not something they really made their home. a minority did make their home there, and I was far more interested in that group. I was interested in, okay, so how do you make your life all over again from scratch? So this wasn't, while this wasn't hidden in a specifically political way, in the way that your story was, it was overlooked, and probably overlooked partly because these people were German and Spanish speakers, so that it what may not be overlooked for German and Spanish speakers, because there is, there's probably literature in those languages. But in terms of something that's available to the Anglophone world, the world in which you and I write, there wasn't really anything, and that might have been part of languages, maybe partly that not everyone's a writer, not everyone wants to relive that experience. So there's a lot of reasons why that didn't get told. I mean, and as you know, the more you investigate into any of these stories, the more kind of untold things you come up with. So one of the things, so when I was first talking to John Galanter, he told me a story, of 2 times he ran twice into Klaus Barbie on the streets of La Paz. And I thought, Klaus Barbie? I mean, I was just imagining what it must have been like to arrive somewhere so difficult after so much hardship, to think maybe you might have a modicum of safety, although Bolivia had its own issues. And then to realize that the Nazis followed you, I just can't. I mean,
The most shocking part of this book for me
yeah,
was when suddenly the Nazis started to turn up in Bolivia. I was just blown away by that moment.
yeah. I mean, I wanted to imagine, like, I didn't want to imagine, but I was compelled to imagine what it must have been like to run into them. And then I kind of split the way I thought I would have reacted, because I would have reacted 2 completely and entirely different ways. And one of those ways I gave to Orly, and one of them I gave to her mother, and let them fight it out. So that way I didn't have to, take a specific point of view.
I was right there with her mother, I got to tell you.
Yeah. So I mean, and um, just as a little bit of background about Orly's mother is, so when the 3 of them came over, um, Orly's father used music as a way to adapt to his new surroundings. So he took in Bolivian students, he learned Bolivian music, he found a new creative freedom in being able to play this new kind of music and to learn from these other cultures, in a way that was exciting to him artistically. And Orly takes up a Bolivian instrument. She learns the charango, whereas her mother, quite possibly partly because she was a singer, and singing uses your body as your instrument. And I mean, for technical reasons, it's quite difficult to walk and sing at the same time at altitude. And being an opera singer in La Paz is not something that I ever saw happen when I was there, let alone back when Orly was there. But her mother, because she's left a son behind in Europe, she cannot get past the grief of that. She cannot accept the change of her circumstances. She cannot accept being forced to live in some place that she doesn't like, that challenges too many of her beliefs and assumptions about the world. And she stops singing. And I think it's because she stopped singing that she turns to a new hobby that puts their whole family in danger, which brings us back to the Nazi bit. But anyway, won't say anything more about that. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for me to ask you another question before we?
Yeah, let's do one more, and then we'll
okay.
take some.
That sounds great.
So would you like to talk about first memories, Aimee, or would you prefer to write about, or would you prefer to talk about female agency?
Let's talk about Claire, because that's another
Okay.
big part of my that's another untold story. So Claire,
Right.
as an anthropologist, has studied the languages of the Andamanese tribes, and that gives her the basis for a whole new code. One of the it's not an untold story exactly, but it's still not very well known, is the role that Native American tribes played in World War I and World War II. We've now heard a little bit about the Navajo code talkers, but back in World War I, there were the Choctaw code talkers, and they use their own language, which no Germans had ever heard of, or no Europeans had ever heard of. And so when they were out in the field in the middle of war, they could talk with impunity over the field telephones and all of that. And they did during World War I, and none of their missions were ever detected. So if they would say, the supplies are going to be sent to XYZ, in 45 minutes. The Germans would have no idea where XYZ was because they were talking in Choctaw. So I tripped across this as I was trying to figure out how to keep Claire engaged. Once she's stuck in Calcutta and her husband and her son are trapped behind enemy lines in the Andamans, the historical convention would be, oh, she's just stuck in Calcutta and has to sit there and hope for the best, or hope that some military expedition will rescue them or do something. And that would be deadly. That is deadly to fiction. You cannot do that to your main character. You have to have your main character be, active in her own rescue. Right. So I needed to figure something out. And I realized that Claire's anthropological work gave her precisely that tool of creating an unbreakable code for use in the field. And then I will give away that due to circumstances outside of anyone's control, she winds up on a special operations mission to go back to the Andaman Islands. And she's very specifically told that it is not a rescue mission, but of course she's determined to make it a rescue mission. And so that's she does go on the mission. I'll say that much.
Yeah. No spoilers. So we do have some great questions from our participants, and we'll start with one from Angela. When researching historical facts, how do you determine what makes it into the book? You obviously have too much information, or I would imagine you do.
You go, Jen.
Okay. Yeah, that is a very hard thing to do. I find that people always ask me, do you research first or do you write first? And I think either of those is impossible. I have to do them together alongside each other, because without knowing where my narrative is going, I don't know what I need to know. I don't know what I need to research. So I'd have to write to a point in the narrative where, oh, I need to know this, but of course, research does lead you down a million rabbit holes, and you also find exciting things along the way. But with my book, I could have researched just the Austrian part until the end of recorded time, because there is so much in the archives. And I had to be really careful not to waste too much time. I mean, it did take me a very long time to write and research this book, but I thought, okay, I know the mother, she ends up cooking, right? She ends up doing a lot of cooking. Well, I had no idea how to cook in 1940 in La Paz. Like, what did the oven look like? What was the fuel? So I had watched YouTube videos on how to cook over a kerosene burner and pump the liquid into gas, and like those kind of things you don't expect doing. So for me, it's really important to kind of keep an eye on what I actually need to know. And again, you do have to allow yourself some freedom to venture down dead ends, because that's always kind of interesting. But I mean, for me, it's a hugely inefficient process. I mean, you always research more than you need to know, always. And I feel like that I don't know how to do it any other way.
I think you have to, because all that extra research informs what you say. You need. Yeah. My book was 700 pages before it came down to about half that. And
it's easy to do.
And there's so many, and part of it is you don't know which layers of the story are ultimately going to keep. I mean, my story, the human story, had so many. There was so much before the war that I ended up having to cut out. I had so much about the whole colonial history in this area, and the interaction particularly between the British and the Indian convicts and the tribal people, and all of that got compressed and compressed and compressed. So in my opinion, all of the research stays, and is used, it's just not all visible. It's like an iceberg, you know, it ends
Right,
up
right.
sort of, you know,
Yeah.
in the beginning, it's this huge mountain, and then the water kind of rises and rises and hides, you know, a whole bunch of the research below the surface, but it's still there holding like the peak up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really good way to put it. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You need that kind of scaffolding underneath you.
Yeah,
So,
for
yeah.
sure.
So this question's for you, Jennifer. First of all, what time is it in Uzbekistan, and what's the weather
Oh,
like?
oh, that's an easy one. It is. Oh, what kind of?
That's
It's
from
a.
Megan. Hi, Megan.
It's 8:49. It's 8:49. Night is falling. And the weather is, wow, we had our first hot day today. Yesterday we were all in wool sweaters. And today it was insanely hot. But insanely hot is pretty much the rule between now and the end of August. So,
Right.
um,
Well, I don't envy you there. But another question from Megan is, you know, altitude sickness plays a big part in your story, Jennifer. Why did you choose to emphasize it so, and did you suffer from it when you first arrived?
well, it depends on how you define suffer. So I didn't, a lot of people throw up upon landing in La Paz, which is why the flight attendants, I was always listening to the flight attendants complaining, like they hated that leg, like the Miami to La Paz leg. They, you know, because there's all, they were like, oh, how many pukers are we going to have this time? You know, there's always people throwing up when they land in La Paz. So we didn't do that. And we briefly had headaches, but we adapted pretty well. For me, the biggest problem was the total and flattening exhaustion that I felt. But it affects every system of your body. It affects digestion, which doesn't work as efficiently. It affects your ability to sleep. People either got insomnia or they could do nothing but sleep. In my case, I developed two kinds of cardiac arrhythmia while I was living there that I still have. Like they've never gone away. And there's no kind of official diagnosis that altitude caused that, but I didn't have it before I lived there. Um, so I mean, so that was its effect on me. And it is a profound thing that happens to everyone who arrives there. I mean, I never met anyone who didn't feel it at all. I mean, you try to run up the stairs your first day and you know that you are not in Kansas anymore. So, I mean, you can be a elite athlete, come to La Paz and completely fall apart, or you can be a complete couch potato who never moves it if they can help it, and you'll be fine. So there's almost no way to tell how well you'll do. But in terms of how I used it in the story, I suppose it's just because that would be one more challenge they had to overcome. But again, Orly and her family didn't suffer too much because of that. So.
So I just wanted to look it up, and you might have mentioned it before, but just as a reminder, it's 12,000 feet over above sea level. So, you know, significant. I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, for a little while, which is only 7,500 feet, and I felt it every time I returned. So Joseph asks if either of you considered writing these as nonfiction books or as history.
I didn't, because my whole thing started as a dream. So that was my core. So I was just like, I had to obey my subconscious for that. But I have written a number of essays about the nonfiction aspects of it since the book came out, and they kind of just keep rolling out there because there are just so many layers of the nonfiction aspects of it that are fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I, I sometimes feel that as a reader, fiction moves me in a way that nonfiction doesn't always. It doesn't mean there's brilliantly written nonfiction, and which certainly is very moving, but with this particular story, given how many of the survivors are no longer with us, um, I knew it was going to be difficult to get the whole story from any one of them. And even when I was reading the memoirs, they weren't always telling me the bits that I needed to know, like what did their stove look like again? You know, what kinds of food could they get? Like they didn't answer the questions I wanted them to answer. And of course, I did end up researching those things, but I felt that if I reported it as nonfiction, which I did actually consider because I have a background as a journalist, and I thought, well, maybe I should just report this. And then I would have to pick one specific survivor, and memories are not always as good as you want them to be, especially when you're asking people to go back 80 years. And so I thought, well, I can still report as much as I want, but what if I just create the most, I mean, my goal in writing it was to create a context that anyone who lived through that experience would recognize, but to create a fictional story that would be as believable as I could make it. And you know, Aimee asked earlier, which I didn't quite answer, about how survivors responded to the book, and that's been the best thing about publishing this book actually was that almost all of my emails from survivors. And 2 weeks after Exile Music came out, I got an email from a 90-year-old man in Florida who wrote to me and said, your book is so close to my own experience, to my own, that I can't believe you made it up. Like, who did you talk to? Who? Give me names. And so, you know, we became pen pals. But since then, I've heard from so many other survivors, and not only that, but they've shown up at book events that I've done in various parts of the U.S. and they've been able to share with me their story, and that's been really great. You know, just kind of hear more stories. Of course, I did also think, where were you when I was writing this book? I could have really used you, but yeah, it's been really wonderful to connect with all the survivors who are still alive, all across the U.S. Actually, there's so many of them, as well as in Israel and South America. So
I have a little bit of a funny story about the nonfiction aspects of this, because everything that's sort of around my core human story is based on the facts that I could find. And there's an execution that occurs in my story that involves a character named Alfred Bird. And I had very little to go on when I was writing the book. I had kind of the bare bones of stuff that I was able to find in Port Blair. And so after the book was finished, I tripped across a website that's run by his grandson. And I started a correspondence with his grandson, and I learned all of these things about the man that I hadn't known when I was writing the book. And he was as wonderful a character as I imagined, but he was wonderful in very different ways. And in one of the ways that I didn't know anything about, he was the father of something like 6 kids, and he was just an enchanting father. He was like A.A. Milne, you know, and he was beheaded by the Japanese shortly after they arrived. So that is a story that I ended up writing an article about. Kind of, I felt like I had to, you know, sort of set the record straight and honor him. But yeah.
It's also such a compelling scene in your book. I mean, that is a really memorable scene. I remember that scene just gutted me.
Yeah, gutted me writing it too. But it was, you know, I sort of, sometimes I think we all shy away from those horrible, horrible scenes from history. And sometimes I think we have to look squarely at them and really reckon with them. So
yes. Yeah. We do.
Interesting. So we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to end with the future. What are you all working on now? And is there anything we should be looking out for from you all?
I'll go. Because I do a lot of ghostwriting, my publishing schedule of my own work is very, very stretched. It took me 17 years to do Glorious Boy. And I have another book that I've been working on since 2010 now that is, it's a memoir based on my father. When my father died, on his deathbed, he asked me to find a box that he said contained $2 million. And so the book that I have been writing is the book about my search for that box, which I will leave it there.
I am to ask a spoiler question, but I won't because I know that's inappropriate.
Well, I'm hoping if I say this enough times, I'll actually finish this book, and that there will be a few people who will be interested in reading it. So.
Yeah, I'm already interested. Jennifer, how about you? What's on your agenda?
Well, I've just finished writing at least a somewhat competent draft of the next book, which is actually all about colonialism and its ruinous effects in South America. So, but it's specifically about an LGBTQ community living underground in the mining tunnels. So pretty much, you have these mining tunnels dug by colonizers, and this group of queer artists repopulates the tunnels and starts planning a revolution. So that's into revolution post-colonial stuff at the moment.
And
So
is that
Wow.
also based on a historical facts that a group of queer artists were living in the tunnels?
well, I don't know if they were artists, but I met a documentary filmmaker when I was living in Bolivia, a Bolivian documentary filmmaker who was interviewing uh, a population of gay and lesbian people who were living underground at the time, who had all experienced violence, sexual or otherwise, and been thrown out of their homes and forced to live underground. Um, so my LGBTQ population didn't choose to go underground, but anyway, I take it far away from what's happened in real life. But
Right. It's based
anyway,
on a kernel of truth.
yeah.
Well, interesting. Ladies, thank you so much for being here. This was a fascinating conversation about the untold stories and the untold stories to come. And participants, thank you so much for joining us. This was great.